When you picture the British Empire in the Middle East, what comes to mind? Probably conquest, right? Force. But the story of Britain's relationship with the Gulf states, well, it's not what you think. It's this really surprising history of requests, of reluctance, and unique kind of partnership that we're going to unpack right now.
So, the popular perception, and historian James Onley really nails it here, is that it was all about force. You know the picture: a powerful empire imposing its will on these small Arab sheikdoms, using its big navy to get whatever it wanted. It's that classic story of colonialism we've all heard a million times.
But was it really that simple? I mean, what if that's not the whole story at all? What if this relationship was actually driven by something completely different? That's the big question we're diving into, and honestly, the answer might just change the way you see this whole chapter of history.
All right, so let's start by tackling this myth head on, shall we? We're going to deconstruct this whole idea that it was just a simple case of imperial force. The image in our heads is so clear, isn't it? British gunboats sailing into the Gulf, flags waving, forcing local rulers to sign treaties they wanted no part of. But the actual historical record, it tells a totally different and frankly a much more fascinating story. To get it, we've got to rewind the clock a bit and see what the Gulf was like before the British were the main power player.
Okay, so to really grasp what happened, we need to understand the world before Britain's famous Pax Britannica, the British peace. The Gulf wasn't some kind of lawless Wild West, not at all. It had its own very established diplomatic system, its own rules of engagement, and its own way of keeping the peace. And right at the heart of this system was a concept called khwa. The best way to think about it is like a brotherhood fee. A weaker ruler, maybe facing a threat, would voluntarily pay tribute to a stronger power in the region, and in return, that stronger power would basically act like a big brother, offering protection. So, paying for protection? It wasn't some sign of colonial submission. It was just a normal, respected part of local politics. It's just how things were done. So, you had this really clear, repeating cycle. A military threat pops up, and what does a ruler do? They actively go out and look for a powerful protector. It was a smart survival strategy, a way to navigate the constantly shifting power dynamics of the region. And the key thing to remember is this wasn't a system forced on them from the outside. No, this was a local solution to a very old problem. And this whole system wasn't just about money and power. It was all governed by a very strict code of honor. There was this custom called Dakala, and under this custom, granting protection was a seriously honorable thing to do. Refusing a request for protection, that brought shame and dishonor. A protector wasn't just some hired gun. They were morally on the hook for the people they protected. Getting this cultural context is absolutely essential to understanding the rest of the story. Okay, so keeping that local system of honor and protection in mind, let's look at how this whole partnership with Britain really kicked off. The big question is, who was knocking on whose door? 98. Just think about that number for a second. 98. Between 1805 and 1861, rulers in the Gulf formally asked for British protection 98 different times. This wasn't Britain forcing its way in. This was Gulf rulers asking them, begging them even, to get involved over and over again. And Britain's response? For decades, it was basically no thanks. They were incredibly reluctant protectors. Why? Well, they were terrified of getting dragged into messy mainland conflicts. They thought the cost of a permanent Navy patrol would be way too high, and they really did not want the headache of sorting out what they called endless disputes. They were even worried that if they propped up a ruler, he might turn into a tyrant who didn't have to listen to his own people anymore. And this timeline really shows you just how reluctant they were. Look at this. The whole process was so slow, so gradual. It took more than 100 years for Britain to slowly, and you can tell, very hesitantly, accept this role of protector across the different states in the Gulf. This was the absolute opposite of a quick, aggressive imperial takeover. You want a perfect example of this dynamic? Look no further than the story of the Permanent Peace Treaty. Back in 1838, it was a Gulf ruler, Sheikh Sultan of Sharjah, who first came up with the idea. He proposed it, but the British? They rejected it. They were worried they couldn't actually enforce it. It took them another 17 years to finally come around and agree to the very peace deal that the local rulers had been pushing for all along. Of course, once Britain finally did step into that protector role, the relationship had huge consequences. And let's be clear, this wasn't some simple win-win situation. It was a really complex trade-off, full of gains, losses, and some pretty serious dilemmas for everybody. So here's the fundamental trade-off. On one hand, for the Gulf rulers, the benefits were obvious. Security from attack at sea, more stability at home, and legitimacy on the world stage. But the price they paid was steep. They had to give up control of their foreign policy, they lost some of their authority internally, and they now had to answer to the British resident in the area. And this created what historians call the chief's dilemma. Talk about being stuck between a rock and a hard place. The rulers were trapped. They needed their own people to see them as legitimate, but they also needed the British to survive. So if they sided with their own people against what Britain wanted, they risked the British stepping in. But if they sided with the British, they could lose all their credibility at home. A real catch-22. This strange and unique relationship also led to a very, very unusual ending. So let's talk about Britain's withdrawal, the long goodbye, and the surprising legacy it left behind. Now here's where the story gets really counterintuitive. Unlike almost everywhere else in the empire, Britain's decision to leave the Gulf wasn't because of local anti-colonial pressure. In fact, the Gulf rulers were horrified. They wanted Britain to stay. The decision was made thousands of miles away, in London, and for one simple reason: a massive economic crisis at home. The UK government just felt they couldn't afford the military presence anymore. And nothing captures this better than a pretty shocking quote from the British Defense Secretary at the time, Denis Healey. The Gulf rulers actually offered to pay the entire cost for Britain's military to stay. But Healey went on television and rejected it with this really inflammatory remark. It just goes to show, the decision had everything to do with British domestic politics and almost nothing to do with what was actually happening in the Gulf. And just like that, the era of protection was over. Independence came first for Kuwait in '61, and then in 1971, as Britain finalized its withdrawal, Bahrain, Qatar, and the brand new United Arab Emirates all became independent nations. But, the end of the protectorate wasn't the end of the relationship. Not by a long shot. Deep ties remain to this very day. You see it with rulers and officers still training at British military academies. You see it in the huge trade and investment partnerships, and you see it in the big British expat communities still living in the Gulf. That connection, that friendship, it's really endured. And this, for me, is maybe the most telling point of all. Britain's peaceful, almost reluctant withdrawal from the Gulf is a completely different universe from its bloody, violent, and hostile exits from places like Palestine, Aden, and Egypt. It just hammers home how fundamentally different this entire relationship really was. So, it all leaves us with this final big question. Was this a truly unique partnership, one that grew out of a local system of protection that Britain just sort of stumbled into and adapted to? Or was it just a different kind of empire, maybe more subtle, more collaborative, but an empire nonetheless? As we've seen, the real story, well, it's never quite that simple, is it?